Hello there. This episode discusses themes of mental illness, being institutionalized, and gaslighting. Please feel free to listen to our other episodes and take care of yourself.
It's a bit sour when you've watched Clark Kent call his best friends crazy when they might have caught him in the red-blue blur act of it all. Like, if he's the one that's slipping up and getting himself caught and they catch it, he wants to make them feel like they're insane for it because he doesn't want to share his secret. He could just share it. Trust me, they'll be okay with it.
Welcome to Soup-erhero Sundays, hosted by Mika and Becca. We talk caped crusaders in all their glory, from romance to action to downright bad writing. And good. Grab a cup of coffee or a tasty treat because we're about to dig in.
We finally dive into Smallville, kicking off with a deep dive into mental health. We touch on the journey of Lex Luthor. We're going to touch on the stigma of Chloe Sullivan and other characters perpetuate. So given its historical context, we can't hold Smallville to the standard that perhaps we've set for shows like Gotham, but it's very interesting to analyze how the show was one of many pieces of popular media that equated mental illness to villainy. So that is what brings us here today. We've been watching Smallville for like a year. We're on season 4, and we are slowly trudging through the muck that is season 4. I've heard people generally didn't like it, and it's been pretty tough. But one of the biggest reasons for that is their treatment of mental health on the show in both seasons 3 and season 4 so far.
I tried to do a little bit of research for this episode, but it was honestly, for me, I only came up with really 2 main sources, but it was weirdly comforting, although saddening, to know that even in 2007, fans of the show were put off by the archaic and dehumanizing portrayal of mental health facilities and mental illness. So I found a Reddit thread from a year ago, so not too long ago, where somebody posted, they were like, anyone else feel really bad when Lex got left and stuck in there, the mental facility? I know Clark has to protect his secret, especially with who Lex will end up being, but man, especially in the first part where they are playing Johnny Cash is hurt and he has to lie and tries to get him out but then leaves him. Such a bummer. I wish there was a way he could still be Clark's friend and be one of the best villains ever. I would have broken him out though, with a mask maybe.
I love that point because it reminds me of Gotham and how Jim and Oswald are still kind of friends.
I was gonna say, I was like, oh my gosh, this is giving me Jim and Oswald vibes.
Yes.
But yeah, it's genuinely disconcerting to me as someone who has been to the hospital a handful of times for mental health purposes, the idea of being abandoned in a facility that treats you like shit. Not really a fun time. I also think that it's interesting how people are now pointing out how gaslighting is at the forefront of being a superhero. It's just very clear. I know recently I sent you a video of Clark Kent and Lois Lane talking.
Yeah.
And we both, I'm pretty sure both of our initial reactions were,
Clark, you're gaslighting hard here.
Which, I don't know which movie that was from.
I don't know either. It's one of the older ones.
I assume the 80s or 90s.
For Smallville, it's the 2000s, so I think that we can give it a little bit more slack, or I don't know, just knowing the context of the rest of media at that time. It doesn't mean that it was any less wrong. In 2007, I found this forum that discusses this same thing. It's titled Smallville Mental Hospitals versus Real Mental Hospitals. Somebody says, I have a feeling tonight's portrayal of a mental hospital is going to be rife with inaccuracies, so I thought I'd start a thread about it. Stick your thoughts in here. And then we have people sharing that, I've never been to a mental institution, but I'm sure they don't look like that. The one I saw was just in a regular hospital, long hallway. They're really just describing what it's actually like. Some people share more detailed experiences, but the general consensus here is that they're all not looking forward to the portrayal of mental facilities and mental hospitals in the episode. I don't know, I feel like it would be so much more powerful if Clark had shown up for Lex in the way that the more recent post was describing,
break him out of there, wear a mask.
I just think that it would have been so powerful to see a Superman who faces mental health in an honest way, and this is probably why I find myself connected to Lex more often than not.
As far as Clark and Lex go, I mean, there's a few factors to consider, right? One of which is that Clark is a teenager, although played by like a 27-year-old. He's a teenager. And he's bound to make mistakes with his friendships and stuff like that. That I can understand. We've been watching The Vampire Diaries lately. We definitely understand that. This is present since season 1 up through season 4. And it's kind of the same curse I feel that Gotham has, which is that it's setting up to a point where someone has to be the hero and someone has to be the villain. And historically, that's been a very concrete position. But they tried to do this thing where they're like,
but what if Lex and Clark were friends?
And then, because they have to fit into that mold of villain versus hero, they mess it up by doing this thing where Clark's like really distrustful of him all the time. And so you don't really get a solid friendship, which Michael brings so much to Lex, and I think the writing does a lot for Lex too, most of the time. But he's actually a really good friend to Clark. And to a lot of Clark's friends. Like, he's actually a pretty good ally to have at the time. But it's because Clark is so suspicious of him all the time, for whatever reasons, and distrustful of him, that pushes him away. And this part is kind of meant to be a big moment of that, where he really needed a friend to show up for him, and he didn't have one. Which sucks, because Clark's supposed to be your hero, and you're watching Smallville, and you're watching Clark's adventures, but he's insufferable. And you want to root for the bad guy, who is a good guy. And I think that them choosing to make Lex good and choosing to make his dad like the villain was a really smart move and a really interesting move. They deliver pretty well on that up to this point, and it's just that Clark kind of falls short when it comes to that. He definitely gaslights a lot. It's a bit sour when you've watched Clark Kent call his best friends crazy when they might have caught him in the red-blue blur act of it all. Like, if he's the one that's slipping up and getting himself caught and they catch it, he wants to make them feel like they're insane for it because he doesn't want to share his secret. He could just share it. Trust me, they'll be okay with it. Like, we've seen that. We saw that with Pete. You know, he's just, and he is a teenager, so I know that's an element of it, but the gaslighting is hard to watch.
Right. It made me think of Matt and Karen and the whole, is he an alcoholic? Is he not?
Yeah, she thought he was an alcoholic the whole time.
Yeah. And I just feel like surely there has to be a different way to go about being a superhero and keeping a secret without like directly telling somebody you're crazy for thinking that, or I don't know what you saw. When you were talking about how they're like setting Lex up in a different way, in like this refreshing way, in my head I was like, maybe their intent was to show how Lex didn't have anybody show up for him and that's why he became a villain. But I feel like to really make it seem like that was the intent, they would have Clark face some sort of consequence for it, at least immediately for that, or like have somebody else call him out on that behavior, really make it seem in the story that this was the wrong thing to do. But I don't think they did that. I'm pretty sure that they were just like,
I don't think so either.
Clark's just a bully, trying his best.
It's also very weirdly pointed because he works with Lionel in the same situation. He won't trust Lex, but he will set aside his differences with Lionel. It doesn't work.
It doesn't.
As well as it could.
No. I constantly joke now that we're rewatching The Vampire Diaries as well. Like, we should have like a little counter at the bottom of every episode. How many times has a character been referred to as crazy? And I think a good example of that in Smallville is how, I guess, like Chloe approaches mental illness, really wants to run away from that. I've never actually watched Smallville before we started watching, so like I would see a few episodes here and there, but I was like a child. I was a small bean, so I don't actually remember or know where they're going with that. I know it has something to do with her mom being mentally ill, and she doesn't want to be mentally ill because her mom is. And I just think that her aversion to mental health issues is understandable, but when there's nobody on screen advocating for mental health, it tastes bad, it tastes sour, it tastes bitter, because then what does that mean again for like people who do have mental illness? It really just paints them as the villain. The only person really who deals with mental illness like openly at this point is Lex, and he's in a terrible facility. So don't be crazy, kids.
They do this thing with Chloe which we noticed especially early on when it was kind of the Chloe versus Pete show. And with her and with Clark, the way that they talk about mental illness and dismiss people who deal with it is really upsetting because they're painted as the heroes of the show. Chloe is not painted as an anti-hero or villain. She might have certain arcs or something, but she is a hero. She's an ally to your main character, and she can be really dismissive. And I know that episode was so weird. It was the episode with like the nightmare powder or whatever, the Jonathan Crane-esque like disease or something, where it made her have this nightmare about her mother and about being locked up in an asylum, which is fine, but it doesn't hit when, like you said, whenever there's nobody really speaking out for mental health. And honestly, you mentioned Lex is maybe the only one, but Lana Lang deals with a lot of that too. All of her mental health is completely pushed aside. It's the way that they completely gloss over any of the trauma that she faces as a teenage girl, being abducted and sexualized and stalked and everything that she is. Yeah. They do that thing like they do in Gotham, where someone in that thread had mentioned it looks like a 50s asylum, like some old school asylum, which I kind of have a love-hate relationship with how people pull on the past like that, because real people actually went through a lot of hell for that.
Right.
And that can make for an entertaining setting or an entertaining story in the right situation. But in shows like Smallville and Gotham, it's very much a mockery.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel good.
No.
I mean, I've never been in an institution either. I don't even know if that's accurate to call it that. I've never had to do that myself, though I have known some people who have. So I'm not the most well-versed on it. I'm not any kind of expert on what it should be like, but it is, as far as media goes, definitely a caricature, and they play up a lot of what Lex goes through in that in a pretty upsetting way. And then he doesn't really get any support out of it either, which, like, to your point, he's a villain, or will be. Maybe it just sucks to watch someone go down that path.
Yeah.
But it is unfortunate.
I feel like there's a tasteful way to approach calling back to past iterations of the asylum. I feel like what they could have done with Gotham, for instance, is if they really wanted to make a statement, like with how old-timey it looked, it could have been that this is how badly funded the mental health care is in the city, and it could have underscored whatever points that they were trying to make with, like, Gotham needs a hero. Instead, it was just, haha, look at all these crazy villains going to do crazy villainous things. So I just feel like there really is a way to approach it. I mean, honestly, I steer away from things like that usually, because when they did that sort of storyline with Teen Wolf, for instance, I stopped watching for a little bit because I was like, I don't like really this. It doesn't taste good. So I'm not an expert either, but I feel like you can do so much more if people are educated, which again goes back to who are we letting into the writers' rooms, I guess. Yeah.
It's very much just entertainment purposes. It's just there to be like, look at these crazy people being crazy. They really do that. They play on a lot of stereotypes and caricatures of mentally ill people. It made me think of some of our conversations about mental illness and mental health in the Netflix Marvel Cinematic Universe and how they've handled it and pros and cons. It makes me think of how we really need positive representation, even and especially in superhero stories, which is why we talked about therapy in the Marvel Netflix universe and how that can play an important role. We recently started watching Jessica Jones again, and there was a lot in there about her not wanting to go to therapy because she doesn't trust it. And I think that's all very valid. It echoes Dina. Not to derail too much, but it's just, I think that they were doing something that discusses it a little better than shows like Smallville had in the past. And again, 2000s, it's a little different. Which made me think about it, and we haven't actually started Superman and Lois. And I didn't really think I was going to. I didn't really want to. But even just this episode alone, I was like, I wonder if there's anything fresh or anything new about Clark in Superman and Lois that maybe would be better than previous iterations. Like, is he still gaslighting the way that Superman always gaslights? We watched that clip, and it was just so interesting to me in that old movie because he really goes hard on the gaslighting, and then as soon as she calls him out on it, Lois is like, you could have just told me.
When I tried to search for things related to Smallville, I think one of the related links that came up was an article talking about, the title was Superman and Lois Handling Mental Health, something like that, in a positive way, is what I saw. I'd at least watch that scene, whatever scene or episode they're referring to. I'd be down to like check that out, because I think that is refreshing, like to earlier points of how cool would it have been to see Clark Kent, this paragon of good, actually speak up
good.
And
I love
he's
him,
so
okay?
brave for
I love
being
Clark.
good.
I even love Smallville Clark.
We'll probably touch on that in like future episodes too, just like the goodness of Clark and how and why seeing that is important. But yeah, these were our thoughts about mental health so far in Smallville.
Maybe we'll come back with another episode when we finally finish the show.
Yeah,
we're about
like,
halfway through.
yeah.
We're almost halfway.
Yeah, and like you were
hard.
telling me earlier, like it's just been hard to watch. Every episode, somebody brings up mental illness in like a really tasteless way, and obviously, it's the times, but it's also like, is this necessary to the plot?
Right.
So that's why it's been taking us so long, but we've gotten this far. We can chug along.
We'll
I'm sure
get
we
there.
can do it.
We gotta get to Oliver Queen.
Pretty much, yeah.
Although
Anyhow.
when Lex is no longer present, I will feel really sad.
Yeah, no, me too. I didn't expect
it'll be
it,
hard to
but
get through. There's definitely some wins as far as representation, as far as maybe accuracy or being able to relate, but it's just the way that the characters talk about it. It doesn't really work, and that's what we think. That's why we're here today. I'll tell you that it doesn't work.
yeah,
For this
pretty
old
much.
show that's like 20 years old.
Yeah. Nothing groundbreaking here. But thanks for listening anyway.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I knew I wasn't crazy.